we had sort of deluded ourselves into thinking in Web 2.0 that we were building public infrastructure, that social media, that the word social and social media might have multiple meanings and one of them might be public. My thesis is that humans invent things all the time. And for the first 30 years, we call them technology. And then if they work, we call them infrastructure. The moment when something goes from being a technology to being an infrastructure is almost always exactly the moment where people take it for granted.
Hi, Rabble.
Hey, Alice.
So this week's guest is nicknamed Neb, someone you've known for a long time. And actually, we recorded this conversation quite a while ago in Amsterdam. So tell us a little bit about Neb and how you know him and, you know, what you guys talked about.
So Neb is a designer. Neb was the original designer on Flickr. He named Flickr. It was part of the original team that created it. And he is someone who has been really looking at how do we design spaces, physical spaces in our city and also digital spaces to create pro-social behavior. And so Flickr, as you know, folks might know, was the first big photo sharing app that provided a space and for connecting people. And Neb was really critical to that, figuring out how to connect people together and what it means to connect and to create and to build community. And he actually moved from working in the digital space to being very frustrated at the neoliberal laissez-faire way in which the American city and the American system is regulated, and has done a lot of work in the Foundation for Public Code, where they're talking about the intersection of technology and urban planning. How can he work with governments to design better pro-social environments for our digital environments and for the physical cities in which we live?
Fascinating. I can't even imagine what the connection might be. So let's take a listen and find out.
Absolutely. I'm very excited to have Neb on the podcast. Neb named Flickr and was part of the original team that created Flickr, and that's where we met in the early Web 2.0 days, and now runs the Foundation for Public Code and has really looked at both social media, but also policy, open source technology, government policy, and urban planning itself. And I think that that's such an interesting combination. It has so much insight into the way in which social media works, the way in which human systems work. So welcome.
Thanks, Rabble. It's really great to be here. I'm excited to talk about a lot of that stuff. The first order of business is to sort of talk about the strange origins of Flickr, because it's kind of an interesting framing of how all of this stuff interrelates, because it sort of was a byproduct of the original task that we had set out for ourselves in the startup that we created, which was called Ludicorp, which was about designing an online, massively multiplayer game about collaborative creativity. And we really had arrived at that after thinking about for a very long time, thinking about things like MUDs, which were, massively user dungeons, which were ways that people used to log in. Sometimes the first ways that people used to be simultaneously on one computer system in a social context. And a lot of these things emerged in the, text computing era. And then we kind of, from there, ended up starting to talk about massively multiplayer online games, which was, a thing that was just emerging at the time, that just before Flickr was released. There were a lot of early games that were a way for people to be in real-time social spaces online for the first time in a long time. And it was, a heady time. This was really before Web 2.0 began. Because, of course, Flickr and Twitter were two of the companies that were at the beginning of that era.
Flickr is almost the most iconic Web 2.0 company as it launched and came out. It defined
and I think
the space.
The sort of narrative at the time we were all talking about, because all of us that were involved were in the early. Many of us worked at the early web design companies. Was kind of the first. That was kind of Web 1.0 was the model of having a design agency that would take an open tool like Apache or another web server and turn that into a website for a company. And that was the first wave of sort of everyone beginning to understand what the web was going to be, was website based. There were no apps, there were no online applications at the time. And it was just about understanding how do we even socially participate in this process? And so there was a lot of, heady conversation. That was also one of the first times that I started spending time in Europe, because I had been, as someone who worked in these web companies, I had been speaking a lot at conferences in the US, which at the time were almost always product defined. They were always like Oracle World or, something like this, where you were going to go and the conference is going to be about feature sets and the way that you implement it for a corporate client and these types of things. And I came over here and spoke at a couple of conferences. The first one I came to was here in Amsterdam. It was called The Doors of Perception, which already gives you some context as to how different it is than most technology conferences. But it really was about, sort of what we did. Another thing we didn't have a term for at the time, which was speculative design, which was thinking about what a future could be like if certain things existed, building narrative universes around the development of things. And so we were talking a lot about things like online gaming and, where the idea of building applications online, which hadn't even really happened yet, was going to go. And so it was at one of those conferences, actually, that both Stuart Butterfield and I were speaking at, that we were wandering around town, just amazed at how this sort of collaborative experience of the production of the city of Amsterdam itself had been so successful. And we were wondering, how does one make that kind of experience online? And that sort of inspired us to start thinking about building a game about collaborative creativity, which was where sort of the game Never Ending evolved out of. And so that was what we, sort of set out to do with a bunch of other co-founders. And it was like an interesting sort of moment for us to realize that we had built this thing that was so flexible and so powerful that it almost was out of the comprehension of even the people that had funded our endeavor, because they sort of didn't understand how big this was before anything like YouTube or any of these other sort of media sharing applications existed. And so Flickr was really one of the first things to deliver what we used to call social objects. This is, the things we would discuss in these conferences in Europe were things like, how do we make, social systems that pivot around a media object? This was a hypothetical thing to be talking about, in the late 90s. And then, of course, with the arrival of Flickr and Twitter and Delicious, which unfortunately is another of the pillars of that era that is now gone, which was really about understanding, the web itself and sharing that as a folk wisdom. There was another word that's now gone, which is Folksonomy, which played a big part in Flickr, which was of the time before the algorithm took control. It was about everyone adding metadata manually.
It was a human-driven sort of curation, discovery, categorization process where everyone would go in and provide their own hashtags, and you'd put your own hashtags. And the hashtags weren't meant to manipulate the algorithm. The hashtags were meant about community discovery.
That's right. And so it's kind of a giant barn raising about the ontology of the internet. And that was like one of the things that was so interesting to understand. Once Flickr was underway, Flickr was definitely one of the first things out of the gate that had this kind of objects having a page on which people were commenting and people having, a profile that had all of their galleries. That was another thing that was really, really interesting about Flickr, and part of, what I found sad about the turn, that Flickr never showed up, on mobile in the way that Instagram did, and also never had this paradigm, which was a huge shift for social media, and the thing that really, has, for me, felt like the closing down of the freedom of social media, which was the control of the algorithm. Once you arrived into applications that were sorting for a likability, then you left the era that we were in at Flickr, because a lot of the tooling we built at Flickr was around curation and not just photography, right? And that was part of what was so interesting about that era.
There were all these groups and lists, and you went and you tagged people and you collected things, and then you could see who had liked your stuff. And it was this whole curation social layer there that a community of people were supposed to do things. And I think that one of the things that we heard a lot in that era was the community creation, the community building. Right. And that eventually the algorithms got so good at doing it that you forget that you're creating a community.
Right. Well, you don't even have the soft ties of community, which are sort of the familiarity. It's all one to many, and the one is the algorithm, and the many are the people on the outside of it. Whereas like the community now is about, do people have trust in the bot that they're asking? That's basically, it's a community of one,
yeah.
And the surround is brought to them by the algorithm entirely. And before that, it was like, well, here's what the algorithm is offering up as fragments of media that they should consume. And before that, it was like, what in the Twitter case was very, very obvious was just because Twitter was a linear timeline for its users previous to the arrival of the algorithm. And then once it left the linear timeline, that was the moment where it was recognized that Facebook's business model was way more profitable than Twitter's, because they could manipulate the algorithm because they then insert advertisement wherever they wanted to, and you wouldn't know why you were being presented things. And so that takes agency away from the user. And so Twitter had to leave the linear timeline and away from from business model perspective in order to keep up with the extractive Joneses, I guess, and make sure they got as much out of their value out of their users as possible. Flickr didn't really ever have that pivot moment. It just it gave it gave over its user base to applications that had been designed around that. I mean, Instagram was one of the first cases of in a way the father of TikTok, right? Whereas each generation gets more fine tuned in the way that it can trigger the lizard brain in the consumer to make sure that they are addicted to the application. And so like Instagram definitely found this addiction quality that Flickr never had, because Flickr had a different kind of quality, which was about community enmeshment in communities. And there is a type of user that was forsaken by Instagram, which were the people that were building these types of things together and enjoyed that process, who were the curators, or now what we call sort of the stewards of community and the objects that the community is focused around. The flow of interest, is no longer a thing that's in the control of stewards. It's in the control of the algorithm.
Stewards are such an interesting concept because they're about an empowering. The mods on Reddit are kinds of stewards. Like the people running the groups are kind of stewards. They're the people doing the social labor that makes things come together. And Flickr had a very clear, explicit role for them. They were groups, and they were group admins, and people organized in-person events where they would go all go and do a walk in a space and take photos together. And it was a physical in-person gathering, but it was all a digital gathering. And then you had the online representation of it. And that some of that got lost. That sort of idea that we have traditional human organization and agency in it, and that somehow it's just this algorithm. And the algorithm around ads pushes you to have this passive consumption. Mm. I remember after Flickr got bought by Yahoo, the debates about the subscription model, so that people had Flickr Pro accounts and they would pay a monthly fee to do it, so they were not the product, and the advertising product. And the Flickr team wanted to keep themselves aligned between the business model and the users. And that was a profitable business. Like Flickr did well with those subscriptions. Like people just paid for it and they were not the product. The product was this thing that they were using. And Yahoo kept fighting to try and build an advertising model on top of it that the users didn't want, that the Flickr team didn't want. But because Yahoo's business model was structured around this very big ad sales team, and they were like, can't we take this? And it feels like in many ways, Flickr never left that conflict. It just sort of got stuck in there. And then no one could decide who would build the mobile app and whether or not the mobile app would be built by the Flickr team, and whether, it's not like the Flickr team wasn't aware of what Instagram was doing.
Right. No, it was resisting resisting that strategy. And that's, it turned out that, and now we're getting into, a larger conversation, but obviously, a lot of that has to do with the shareholder, and the maximization of value, and what is the, what is, the user-centered design is one thing, but user-centered business models is another thing, and that I think is one of the things for me, that the idea that all of this stuff, what I realized, and part of the reason why I'm here now in Amsterdam and I'm doing what I'm doing, is that, we had sort of deluded ourselves into thinking in Web 2.0 that we were building public infrastructure, that social media, that the word social and social media might have multiple meanings, and one of them might be public. My thesis is that humans invent things all the time. And for the first 30 years, we call them technology. And then if they work, we call them infrastructure. The moment when something goes from being a technology to being an infrastructure is almost always exactly the moment where people take it for granted.
There's no more moral panics. They're not concerned about the kids losing, the kids these days or anything else. It's something that has always been there, and just part of it, it's the air we breathe.
Yeah. And so we're getting there with these network services, web services, application services, this type of thing. And once that's the case, you sort of have to, recognize that is, once something's a right, if someone takes something for granted, it becomes like a right in the society in a way. And once it's a right, that's a public infrastructural service then at the other end of that right, because no one should be denied from that. So you can do that through one of two ways. You can either say, here's regulation that the market needs to obey that makes sure that everyone gets it, which is what some utilities do, like phone companies and things like that. Or you can say, okay, well, this is just something that's provided by a public institution. And really now we're in a moment, an existential moment for this approach, right? Because obviously the current administration in the United States is all about dismantling state capacity, dismantling public capacity, the idea to provide education, the idea to provide communication, the idea to provide mediation. All of those things have been now ruled by the current administration there as 100% privatizable, which is a terrifying moment that we're facing. And so what is the public alternative to that? And can that be something that scales horizontally? I think that's what I'm doing here in Europe, is talking to European public administrations and helping them with building things collaboratively as public infrastructure.
If you look at what Europe is facing, they're looking at an authoritarian regime in Trump and an authoritarian regime in the Chinese Communist Party. And neither of those serve the interests of Europe. And the obvious solution is, what is the social democratic alternative? What is you've got a state that is very interventionist, but believes in an open, diverse society and doesn't believe in top-down organization. How do you cultivate that? How do you build it on top of this open source infrastructure as the alternative?
And so, the thing that's been interesting for me and how I've been approaching this in the last couple of years is that, we spent a lot of time in the early days of the Foundation for Public Code. We, founded it almost 10 years ago. And I'd say for the first 5 years, we spent working with public administrations to try and help them understand how to build capacity to participate in collaborative open source projects so that they could know how they themselves or their vendors could form this kind of collaborative fabric among European states, for instance.
How do they work with these organizations that function so differently than how the state sees things?
That's right. And how do they also build sort of the attach points? Because a lot of times they don't really know even how to there's no there as far as a lot of, procurement processes and things like that. You can't. Open source projects have no representative body, that they're sort of having.
There's nobody to hire to do the work.
Right.
There's nobody to license the technology to and respond to the tender.
That's right. And so helping them understand that was the first part of it. But then now I would say, thanks to the great work of a lot of other very successful nonprofits and other agencies in Europe, there is a movement where this idea of public code or digital public infrastructure in general has been recognized as like a valid approach within the public administrations. Most European states and cities have now, within their government architecture, have a thing called the Open Source Program Office, which is a cross-cutting agency that looks at other procurement by other agencies and says, hey, because a lot of these open products don't have a marketing team, they don't have sales representatives, so a given problem space is defined in procurement and no one is going to show up as the advocate.
And fill out the tender and do the application and do all the things like that. So you have open source tools that could do the job, and you have technologists and firms that can do the implementation work. But because it's not structured in the right way for the state to interact with, they don't know how it is. And so then we end up wasting huge amounts of money. And this is in the US too and everywhere else, where you have these massive technology projects that fit the way the government thinks it's supposed to contract technology, and almost always fail because it's not the way you do technology. And we've seen some interestingly, not left or right, attempts at fixing this. GDS, Government Digital Services in the UK, USDS, which was really interesting, and 18F, which is really interesting in doing work. And then it got taken over and renamed Doge and became this sort of bull in China top.
Yeah, it was a device for destruction. Yeah.
But the tool that was going to be the useful reform ended up being in an authoritarian regime, ends up being this disruptive thing.
Well, and So the thing that now the Foundation for Public Code, this network that I'm helping drive, I guess, is spending a lot of its time in Europe talking about the idea of public product organizations, which is a very specific type of NGO, which can be a stewardship entity for a public code base. So and this especially is true of something that has been developed by a public administration for its own needs, and then it discovers, this is another thing that happened a lot in our earlier days in the foundation, was that we would encounter a public administration who had built something that it was pretty excited about and was solving problems for it, but what it didn't take into account was how, because it's not buying a private product, which cost is amortized over the other clients that the private product has. If it's making something that's open source, they're just the only one. They get to the 5th year of using this thing, and they're like, oh, well, we should probably look up our service license agreement support number so we can call the vendor so that they can make some updates and fix these bugs and advance it for our new operating system release. And of course, no one is there. It was a set of contractors that they hired, years ago, probably in a different administration, to make it. And so the failure rate on open projects that have been deployed in the in public sector is also quite high because the institutional knowledge doesn't exist because you haven't created an entity that is alive. Software is alive. I mean, one of the things that the public administration also hasn't come to terms with is that software as a service in general, and not in the sort of hosted by a third party sense, but even the fact that, if you're a modern software development, product, you're moving forward always. You have a release.
It's not a static thing. It's not like a set of chairs or furniture or vehicle that you purchase.
Yeah.
It is an ongoing thing. And software, the moment you stop building it, the moment you stop extending it, changing it, modifying it, everything else, it dies.
Yeah. When I'm talking to people about the value of something like open source in government is that, my belief is that software has terroir, which is the idea that, again, this is why it's part of the argument about software being a cultural product is that other cultural products, when you talk about food or cinema, you say, oh, this was lovely French food, or this was lovely Italian cinema, or vice versa. But when you talk about software, you don't ever use any of those words. You don't use provenance words at all. But there is provenance that's baked in super intensely, especially to a lot of products that exist in things like urban planning, for instance. If you're in Amsterdam, you do not want to use a software planning tool that has like automatic decision space built in the US because it will it's going to give you a clippy that's going to try and give you, cul-de-sacs.
It's going to push you into all of these regulations and design norms and everything else that the American system has.
That's right.
The width of buildings and the constraints of construction and the needs of different vehicles.
That's right.
This urban design, urban planning thing, I find so fascinating because it is such a direct relevant parallel to social media, so that we see on social media the dynamics of applications or places in these social media apps become cool, become hip, evolve over time. Some of them gentrify, some of them then become staid and old, and it's like where your parents are. And so I find it fascinating that you've done the work both on the Flickr side and with the building of these social media platforms and on the urban planning side. I wonder if you could talk about the parallels between the two.
Well, it's really interesting because obviously, in Game Never Ending way back in the day, it was really totally an overlap because we were, imagining trying to build a virtual town essentially out of the people that were going to come in and be collaboratively creative. But, this is more than that. It functions as two ways of seeing this type of collaborative activity of building community together. The built environment particularly is one in which you have this type of longevity that we hadn't really considered in software products in their earlier phases. But now when you deploy something at a civic scale or larger, like a Facebook or something like that, it does have to be alive, like we said, because it needs to be moving forward and adapting all the time. And the city, has a slower refresh rate in terms of how it decides what it's, how it is constructed for its participants or residents. However, it also has, all these different mechanisms that are the interrelationship between the governance, sort of the rule space. A lot of what, I study in general as, part of my practice, and that's part of why I wanted to build a massively multiplayer game, but also understand urban planning is about emergence in complex systems. How do you build a rule space? And to me, this is the thing that cities do so well, that are well planned, in Northern European cities particularly, have these incredibly well-crafted rule spaces that texture the urban experience, in a way that I think is very interesting to look at for how we design protocol and module-based technology systems, because it is also about, how do you define these different layers, in which products exist, in which experiences exist, in which relationships exist between citizens and, the various entities that they interact with in network contexts. But urban planning, has these characteristics that are, in Dutch, we have this word gezelligheid. Gezellig is like hygge, or these words that are a lot of Northern European countries have, which are about this undefinable quality, which is sort of like coziness and conviviality. And it's something you definitely want the space that you build to have. That Christopher Alexander, who's a famous architect, who's a lot of his work on pattern language is also translated to computer science. He had this quality without a name, he called it, which was something that you couldn't describe about how elements fit together to provide a sense of home, to provide a sense of place. And I think this is also something we really have left undiscovered in software, because we have been in malls most of the time. We've been in big corporate buildings. And so the idea, can you build platforms that allow for more and more localized instantiations until you get to the level of something like a household or a community, and that the terroir of the software, the localized character of the software can bubble up into the experience, in ways that may be defined by a design language that's carried across different tools that you use that are all organized into a platform that just your community uses, or your town, or your high-density residential building, or your family household. And those things, depending on how expressive we can get the tools to help do that kind of configuration and that kind of specialization that bring out the terroir in a larger abstract tool, you end up with something that is a very specific and expressive and adaptive version of inhabiting the software that you're using.
One thing I'm really curious about is I've proposed this idea of a social media bill of rights, which is that people on these platforms and protocols should have the right to own their name and their relationship to people. And they should have the right to privacy and security if they choose to be private, like their data isn't leaked to people. They should have the right to choose over their algorithms and have some sense of them. What is this doing and why? Even if they're complicated, could you have examples of these things where you compare it? You should have the right to self-governance, which is you get to participate in the rules. Doesn't mean that you like every rule or it all goes in your favor. And that you have the right to interoperability and exit. When I proposed it, it didn't seem like I wasn't proposing it to pass a law that somehow was doing this. It was meant for users. It was meant for like the free software community, which is saying, these are the things that make something free software. Mm-hmm. And if you don't do these things, then you can't call it free software. Mm-hmm. And so these are the things that make healthy social media or healthy social media platforms. Now, in the European context where regulation is possible, and you've had GDPR and you've had other kinds of things in the Digital Markets Act, the DMA, that are attempting to reshape how these things work and the experience. How does that fit with your experience, both having built some of these platforms and understanding the regulation, in what people in Europe should be advocating for in building this European stack and building this independent kind of digital infrastructure that's separate from the American and Chinese systems?
It is about literacy in the actual policy space itself, in the regulator, with the regulators, how adaptive is their model of what is happening in the technology space. And it is incredibly, low refresh rate and relatively low res, and it's improving as we go, but the way in which the policymakers understand this space, that's really what the role of a lot of the NGOs that I'm working with is just educational. A lot of the time is like, how do you even understand these types of, stewardship roles and, continuous integration as a process, and, a lot of this, even having the tooling, the back-end tooling to support a modern community, that is around a product. Like, these types of things are not well understood. And so, the sort of two-prong approach, has to be building literacy in the policy organizations to understand how to create the spaces that you're talking about, create the processes and mechanisms that can produce the types of infrastructure and ecosystem that we're looking for. But also, partially what I'm doing right now is, as well as working on the policy space, I'm working in the space of like, let's make instances. Let's make, prototype vehicles that work in this way.
Not just say we should do it. I mean, that's it's the same way I'm working.
Yeah.
Which is I'm saying these are the things we should be doing. These are the politics. These are the values. This is, the podcast. And then I spend the time building examples of it so that you can see it in running code. It gets back to the IETF, thing. We reject kings, presidents, and voting. We believe in rough consensus and running code. And in this case, you're influencing the kings and presidents and the voting process through the construction of running code that then they can then see and use. And so the hope is that we can have a conversation about this that is not just the data. Because at the moment, we've gotten this idea that we put a stake in the ground, which is personal data, private data. And GDPR and a bunch of European regulation did a good job on providing some rights around there that now get adopted all over the place. But when you look at people, they'll give up their private data for almost nothing. Give me your phone address and I'll give you a candy bar.
They don't realize its value. I mean, and I think they're starting to now, but it has been a long road.
People understand the algorithms are having an effect. People understand that there's an unaccountable governance system. People understand that if I leave one platform, I leave alone and I lose all of my people. And so, people understand that they don't have their privacy over their data.
In the public stack, there's both governance. The idea of a public product organization has a governance model. And so that governance model is a way of participating in how it is, what its terroir is, what its assumptions on its own, like I said before, if you're making a piece of digital public infrastructure that is the transformation of, part of the reason why the Foundation for Public Code is called Public Code is about public code is that public and code are sort of have multiple meanings.
Yeah.
Public is both open, but also a public infrastructure, and code is both software and policy. And so the policy part of that is, the idea that you have this, basically, you can have a policy view of what the software is doing so that it is a bridge between those two realms, essentially. They're both instruction spaces. And so you have sort of, it's almost like an ingredient list. It's like, here are the assumptions, which are a bill of rights, per product, essentially. And so therefore you can do some kind of merge analysis of whether the policies that are being used in one piece of infrastructure you're adding to your public administration is, doing the right thing.
And it brings up the fact that in the American model, we have all of these public services that are essential. The emergency services that go out of Twitter, like all of the hosting of this content and the email servers and the alerts and the engagement with people and all these things. And none of those are created by organizations that have a public service mission. Their actual mission legally is they have to maximize shareholder value. This is what caused the Twitter board to be legally forced to sell to Elon Musk because he had done this crazy offer that was double what the market should say. And so it would have been illegal for them to make the decision in public interest.
Right.
And they would have been facing civil and criminal liability for upholding the public interest.
Right, which is interestingly also how the B Corp evolved, right? Because executives wanted the power to be able to refuse something like that based on other criteria rather than just maximizing value. And so it's interesting that, similarly, what we're talking about with the public product is to say, okay, well, this thing now is, in a little bit from the commons, and it is operating in the policy space, of whatever the constraints of the place that it will most likely be implemented in, given this case in the European Union. And, and so the prototype-y kind of example of that is like, can we build an organization that exhibits all of the characteristics of a public product organization that can be sustainable? And what is, can we make a template for that then becomes something that is targetable in the same way that the startup as an entity became a target for the VC pipeline? Can you build another entity that is like, oh, now we understand how we have like attach points, the public infrastructural production process, where these things can be, accelerated by that, by finding multiple public administrations that are willing to contribute. You end up with, almost a way of a grant, making a collaborative grant making process, which is right now one of the biggest ways that Europe invests is through very large, multi-year funding frameworks is what they call them now. And they have these kind of cascade funding things that have, third-party entities that are sort of managing how participation works. But I think that if you also just say, we're going to provide, matching funds or whatever to public administrations at smaller scales, to say we're going to procure these relevant pieces of public infrastructure that are public products, that could be a way of also validating what things are useful that come out of a granted process. It's like, okay, rather than saying we're going to have this open-ended big grant, instead we're going to have a thing that actually takes things that start off as prototypes that emerge from one or two municipalities collaborating on making something like a geospatial tagging product or whatever, notes in space or some little application space they're trying to add for their civic users, and they decide to go into a collaboration. If that works, then you have this scaling process that isn't about acquiring individual users, but instead about acquiring replicators. That you have public administrations that are participating, and that what is necessary there is a robust governance model that allows those other new participants to feel like they have this ability to affect the changes, but also to what is the line between what is called the core application and then what is the configurable part that allows you to differentiate into different kinds of terroir, and are these different builds or distributions, as we used to call them in Linux world. To have the distributions, you may end up having smaller and smaller sets of public administrations that are like, oh, this is just for the province of X within state Y, and then the city gets like a subset of those choices. And this is a way to have a lot of public administrations do have a set of regulations that they have to support at these valences of a Californian city has its own code, it has California code, it has United States code, and so there is a possibility that you have within a stack, you have the common services which also comply to the national regulatory digital infrastructure issues, and you have the California sort of both services that may be added on top as part of the California stack as opposed to elsewhere. And then the, Santa Barbara super fancy interface or whatever, some high value, like taxpayers who are willing to spend extra money to build something nice. But the interesting part about that is that open product may then just still be replicable by others, that they can take that experience, it makes the idea of like sister cities or, even economic blocks into a very interesting new territory of saying, well, these are ways that you can, by sharing a code base, that may be a tighter, in the end, that may be a tighter way for nations to become part of a bloc than something like the European Union.
Yeah, I mean, when I immigrated to New Zealand, some of the immigration software you use and services were provided by the Australian government. So when I went to go submit my health information to immigrate to New Zealand, they're like, oh, well, go use the Australian government. And what happened was the New Zealand government said, well, our systems are very, very similar to Australia. We've got a bunch of treaties with them. We're, a fully independent sovereign country, but we can reuse a bunch of this technology and our legal systems are very similar. So why don't we just share this infrastructure across nations? One of the things I think is fascinating about this whole podcast and what I've been talking is like, it starts out to talk about what are the effects of social media. And to understand the effects of social media, you have to understand the economic incentives and the structures behind it. And to understand the economic incentives behind it, you have to understand the systems and the organizations. And so even though it's all about this digital like ephemeral thing, it actually comes back to a whole bunch of concrete things that have existed throughout the history of humanity, but we create new entities over time. There was a time in which the corporation didn't exist. There was a time in which public infrastructure didn't exist. There was a time in which the idea of a state and citizenship and those services didn't play the same role. And there were moments in history where now we look back and we have a very clean history of it. But if you look back at what happened in the 1930s and 40s, the American system of Western capitalism and the totalitarian system of like fascism that existed in Japan and Germany and like the state communism that existed in the Soviet Union, all of them used very similar sets of public planning and processes, even though they were considered ideologically
on different parts of the spectrum.
And they went to war to each other and they tried to kill each other. But they were all attempting to understand how do you run society and governance with the introduction of the technology of the time, of radio, of telephone, of the emergence of television. And so now what we have is we have all these different parts of the world that have very different ideologies of what we're doing, and we're trying to figure out how to build technology to run society that fits with this digital, networked, open source based system, and even the largest corporations in the world are using mostly open source technology. And what does that mean? What are the constraints of this underlying technology, and how does it shape society? And I think that that's just you can't understand what's going on unless you understand these forces.
Completely, and more so every day. As we are moving into a space where not just the public services, but also most of the things that we do transactionally in the world are powered by software, things socially powered by software. So all of this is, moving into a space where our, really the verbs, that we have access to in how we interact with the space around us and with others and with our, jobs and work and, entertainment, everything is now within the context of this mediating, sort of medium that we're suspended in. And it's sort of, we spend very little time thinking about how that is constructed and who is responsible for it. But I would say, again, this is a parallel with urban planning. A lot of times, on the flip side, a lot of times people get, super concerned about like, oh God, I don't really know, how do I know what's happening with my data? I feel like I'm in control by all these systems. And to a certain extent they are, but if they also live in a city, then there are way more basic things that they don't ever think about. I mean, they have no idea where their food comes from, where their water comes from, where their trash goes to, where their power comes from. People have metabolized the reality of what
who provides the social services are when someone ends up homeless or they're on when they're having a mental health crisis, are there systems of support that show up that are invisible? What is the systems of education and training and cultural events and
all of this
government enforcement of rules and like we have this thing that shapes us.
Yeah, and it's the fact that this rule space that is generated by society and by the civil stack and all of the public stack, like all of this is things that we sort of take for granted about how humans live together in such close proximity. I mean, this is the magic of cities, right? Is that it's incredibly efficient and also provides pretty high quality of life for a lot of the people that are there. A lot of people there, not so much if you live in a state that doesn't have the kind of bandwidth of these invisible services that address everyone, which is sort of what I was saying about the inclusivity that needs to be built into digital public infrastructure as well as public infrastructure in general. But I think that digital public infrastructure is actually in some ways easier to make sure is inclusive across the society. We've now gotten to a point, it used to be that it was very asymmetric because people's access to computation in terms of having a device that they could participate in the network was actually limiting.
We were talking about the digital divide for so many years. Now we don't talk about the digital divide because everybody has access to it.
Yeah, well, and I think now the digital divide is, do you realize how much of yourself you have sold out to participate in this? And that some people do and some people don't. It's sort of like fast food nation. It's like, obviously, if you are willing to go into the space of being commoditized, as a consumer, then you will receive the results of that. And that's sort of what you're saying about the homogenization. Facebook was very different than the previous rounds of, the blogosphere, which is what we sort of came up in. The first round of sort of individual network socialization was very much about providing experiences that were, gesellig, that were like, oh, you've come to my thing and it's very different. And the genius,
welcome to my homepage.
The genius of Facebook was that, there is cognitive work in dealing with difference, and so Facebook was like, well, if we present you with something hyper generic, then it's like going to a fast food restaurant in a foreign country. It's like, oh, well, it may be more exotic and interesting to go to those other places, but this is so familiar that I have very little cognitive load in ordering a cheeseburger, that I know is going to be exactly the same, kind of terrifyingly the same as the cheeseburger that I would have at this place in another country.
But people don't necessarily want that unification. Like they got it because Facebook worked.
That's right.
And in many parts of the world, Facebook with their Internet One and Internet.org thing actually went through and convinced governments and telcos to provide WhatsApp and Facebook and Instagram for free while everything else was charged. But you look at it at GeoCities, you look at MySpace, you look at all these ways in which people can customize their experience and make it their own, they decorate their own space. People want that. We ended up in a place where we could not explore that because a single person was in charge. And if we want to get out of that space, we need to understand what we're looking for. I mean, I remember a couple million people quit Twitter and went to Blue Sky because Twitter was making blocks public. Now, the thing is, blocks are public on Blue Sky. And so people are making emotional decisions of, does this place feel safe? Does this place feel like me? Is it? And then we rationalize it by like, oh, the blocks or this policy or that policy, or they did this terrible thing or whatnot. But really, our decisions about where we're going are social. But we have to have some knowledge about where we're choosing to live. Whereas in the digital space, we don't even acknowledge who the stakeholders are. You know, why aren't female presenting nipples allowed on Instagram? And the answer is twofold. The answer is, partially just California values, which is like weird about sex. But it's also Apple's rules because they're a constraint around it. It's the credit card processing companies' rules, and it's the advertisers themselves who can pull the money out of it. So it's both these economic and control points, and the users are not in that discussion.
Constituency.
They are not a constituency that decides what content they're allowed to produce.
And so the idea that there is a different way of considering how what the roadmap for an application is, a piece of software infrastructure, how is that decision made can be more like an urban planning decision, can be more like a group of specialists that have a full stack of understanding of all of the working parts of the infrastructure that something like an urban plan implies or is meant to produce. This idea of architectural scale understanding of a modular set of interconnected resources, computational resources with protocols is very complex, but it isn't really that much more complex than something like an urban plan where you have to deal with all of the other infrastructural networks and all of the various actors that are going to be involved and all of the roles of the process of development. So, it's not like we're without precedent in building this type of public-private partnership ecosystem around the development of complex infrastructure is a task that really is one of the core tasks of what a city is. And so
we're building digital cities. Like Amsterdam didn't just decide to focus on pedestrian streets and bicycles. There was a whole series of direct actions and protest and lobbying around that, and thousands of meetings, thousands of times in which it was this street is going to change and this other thing. And we're going to take the architectural diagrams and everything else, and we're going to put it in a language and a way of understanding that every single person that is affected by it can see it. And we can have a consolidated process. And it's, it's slow and painful and everything else. But it is a process that is fundamentally democratic. And if we have digital tools that do that, we need to figure out what that equivalent is so that people can do it. And it's not any more complicated than the city.
A very huge part of how the Netherlands exists is through a very detailed consensus building process, which they call here the polder model, which is about polders, which are the large pieces of land that were initially created by the draining of swampy areas by multiple farmers that would come into a collaborative action together to build new land. And the interesting part about that is that the new land was newly created, and thus the law of the land was something that was generated in the consensus, between these people, how is it going to be used? What kind of infrastructure is going to be there? All of that was determined by a collaborative process that involved many of these meetings. And it's the way that Dutch society is structured is around the process of finding consensus and then peer policing the consensus once that has been achieved, which means that it is, fundamentally an anti-authoritarian place because its process is very distributed, but also that it has a tolerance for the idea that, to have infrastructural success, aka to have a nation that is almost more underwater than not, be arable land and highly productive and, filled one of the highest density populations in Europe, producing the most produce after the United States of any exporter. This is it is an incredible achievement what they have done with the physical Netherlands. And a lot of that comes from this emergent process of consensus building.
I want to wrap up with two things. One, asking you, who do you think should also be in this conversation? Who should I talk to?
That is a very good question. There are a couple of folks who I really think have a lot to say, especially in the context of social media and how it might happen in public. And I think probably there are a couple of people here in Europe who are participating in the policy level. I don't know if that's a direction that really makes sense in this context, but I think you may have already spoken with Evan Pedromu, but
no, but he's on my list of people.
Yeah, he's definitely already in that space. There are a couple of folks from the beginning of Web 2.0, certainly Stuart Butterfield, those of us who are kind of at this crossover space of thinking about games, thinking about play, and thinking about, how to be together, in a digital space as a kind of collaborative, creative effort. I think those people should be on the short list.
Is there anything you want to close with that sums up sort of your experience going from building the web, building Flickr, through working on understanding the parallels to urban planning, to actually working on the digital versions with governments and figuring out what these institutions are? That arc is fascinating because you've seen the commercial startup parts, you've seen the social dynamic parts, and then saying, how do we make this a public for all of us?
I think that going from the venture-backed world of software engineering back to something that is sort of a mix of the public and the private, but particularly the understanding that really at the core of a lot of the creativity that we saw come out of the industry of building software in the last 20 years was empowered by a very specific form of organization, and that we need to find alternatives to that form of organization. The idea that we've been focusing on the software and not really focusing on the vehicles that people occupy in order to make the software. And I feel like that is something that we have missed in this focal depth. And I think that the open source community tends to also miss it as well, because it has this, very libertarian view that is, suspicious of any attempts to organize sometimes, but I do think that there is a cruising altitude kind of at which complexity emerges, where you have this kind of, a certain scale of organization that has both flexibility, adaptiveness, but also sustainability and, institutional recognition. Like that is a crossover, that's a bridging space between the opportunity that exists here in Europe, but I think elsewhere, of public administrations as they rethink this move towards from technology to infrastructure for a lot of these things that we take for granted, like social media. Like, what is the public product organization for me is the proposal I have about this space, but whatever it is, whether it's that specific form or another type of form, finding a way to build for the types of people that are creative participants in the making of these tools and the making of the community around the tools. How do they party up? How do they become something to collaborate on that can actually continuously? How
do we organize ourselves as humans to do the work?
That's right. And I think we're at an opportunity to do that very differently now for a number of reasons, partially due to global political instability, where things get reorganized out of these huge, sort of radiating fields of American technology corporate dominance. How do you have an emergent process to empower the people that have the ability to create alternatives to those toolings that are distributed and yet also have the context of being able to function well in the societies that they're in, because they have taken on some of the work of providing the rule space, that the state often undergirds things like super functional things like cities or giant infrastructures or, provinces that exist underwater or airports, like all of these things are, enormously scaled human endeavors that have been produced, in the context of a public framing, with public-private partnerships and all sorts of other organizations that are commons-based and things like that participating. But I do feel like the idea that you need to understand the relationship between public infrastructure and agile technological development in ways that we haven't seen yet, and finding those, innovation. We've talked a lot about innovation all the time, and most of the time the innovation happens in the space of the actual technological stack. But I think the innovation around, how can the public sector and the private sector work together to make these things into infrastructure, I think is where we should be concentrating some of our thought about all this.
Well, thank you so much. It's absolutely fascinating. I really enjoyed it.
It's been a pleasure.